Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Our podcast identifies issues that influence and impact the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every organization's mind: how will my business be impacted? To effectively and immediately respond to cybersecurity data breaches and remain compliant with the constant bevy of new data privacy laws, you need to know what data your organization is collecting and from whom. On this episode of We Get Privacy for Work, we discuss data mapping, the most efficient way to keep track of the information your organization is collecting and storing. Today's hosts are Damon Silver and Joe Lazzarati, co-leader of the firm's privacy, data, and cybersecurity group and principals, respectively, in the firm's New York City and Tampa offices. Damon and Joe, the question on everyone's mind today is, what is data mapping? How do I implement it? And how does that impact my organization?
Welcome to the We Get Privacy podcast. I'm Damon Silver, and I'm joined by my co-host, Joe Lazzarati. Joe and I co-lead the Privacy, Data, and Cybersecurity group at Jackson Lewis. And in that role, we and other members of our team regularly receive a variety of questions from clients, all of which boil down to the core question of how do we handle our data safely? In other words, how do we leverage all the great things that data can do for our organizations without running headfirst into a wall of legal risk? And how can we manage that risk without unnecessarily hindering our business operations?
So on each episode, including this one, Damon and I are going to talk through a common question that we get from clients. And we're going to walk through it in the same way that we talk about it with our clients, meaning that we're going to try to be as practical as we can. We're going to think about, what are the legal or other types of risks that we face, what options may be available to manage those risks, and what should we be mindful of when we go to execute on where we will land after that question. And so today, our question is, what is this thing called data mapping, and do we really need it, right? And I think a lot of companies are wondering about that, particularly following the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. But I think it's probably something that really goes beyond that. At least it's something to think about beyond just the CCPA. Maybe, Damon, why don't you kick us off and kind of maybe define it, and we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. So data mapping is essentially a process for tracking what data your organization collects, who it relates to, where it came from, how you're using it, whether and to whom you're disclosing it, where and for how long you're maintaining it. It's basically your inventory of your data environment. And for many of the clients we work with, this is a concept that is relatively new. It's existed under the GDPR for a number of years in the EU. In certain sectors like the healthcare space, it's existed under HIPAA for a while. But as Joe mentioned, the CCPA and also the proliferation of data breaches and all of the website tracking claims we've seen recently have put this issue of data minimization and data mapping into much more of a prominent place for organizations as they're trying to think through how best to manage their data privacy and security risk. And Joe, I'd be interested in your thoughts here, but from my perspective, I think perhaps the most compelling reason for doing data mapping and focusing on the issue of data minimization is trying to better manage data breach risk. Sure, you do want to comply with the CCPA. There are other reasons to do this, but in so many of the breaches we handle, and we are seeing definitely, at least anecdotally, an uptick in breaches in recent months, so much of the impacted data is data that the client we're working with has essentially lost track of, hadn't, for that reason, adequately secured. In many cases, didn't really have a good reason to continue maintaining it. But nevertheless, it was there. It was sitting in that email account. It was sitting on that legacy server from an acquisition 10 years ago. It was in the document management system. No one's touched it for 7 years, but meanwhile, it's now within the scope of the breach. So I'd be interested in your thoughts just on, what is the the value of data mapping? Why is it worthwhile to undertake that exercise?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? I think certainly addressing data breach risk is a critical function. It's like, you get that, you get 6 people get emailed a document, and let's say that document is a census file. Who's on a leave of absence, which patients' bills were paid, who's enrolled in the retirement plan, whatever the case may be, you kind of get these documents that may have a ton of information that goes to, again, a group of people, and they all save it, right? They all have it saved in their email account, and maybe they save it in whatever your document management system is, a share file, whatever it is. But now you have 6 documents, in 6 different places with information on 1,000 people. Now, those 1,000 people may all be the same people, so you're not expanding the number of people necessarily, but you're making it easier for the bad guys to find it and to act on it. And so just knowing that you're doing that, right, can help to kind of tighten the screws a little bit around managing data. So I think that's certainly one really critical. That's just a little bit of a crude example of how this, I think, can be actionable. So I think that's one thing. But I think also, a lot of times we focus on personal information because that's what triggers notifications on the data breach laws. But the company may have very confidential business information. They may have their clients' information, and the same issue arises that you're create by increasing the footprint of different data in the environment that you have. You're creating additional risk, maybe not even from a criminal threat actor outside the organization, but it could be from a rogue employee inside the organization. And so, understanding where that data is not only can help minimizing the data, but you might also be better able to find out where it was. And because the map, right, you'll be able to speed up your investigation to figure out how this happened through more deliberate understanding of your information systems. So, those are a couple of things. And then the last thing I'll mention, and I think there's other reasons, but we're seeing, the 23andMe bankruptcy filing came up, and there was a CCPA, the Attorney General in California put out an announcement saying, I think essentially saying, customers may want to delete that data, right? I think the notion of people understanding their rights with respect to data in certain states and certain countries, we're going to see that increase. And so it will, if you don't know where this data is in your environment and somebody asks you to delete their data and you have a legal obligation to do that, or maybe a contractual obligation, but either way, going about doing that becomes difficult if you don't know where that person's data is. And so then being able to, or responding to them and to say, yeah, we deleted your data, you might be like, did I really do it? So those are some of the things I think that can be helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Joe. And I would add, under the CCPA, there's, I think, about 20 states now that have a law similar to the CCPA and similar to the GDPR on their books, either in effect or taking effect soon. There is an obligation to provide pretty detailed privacy notices. And you're not really in a position to do that if you don't know what types of data you're collecting, if you don't know where you got that data from, if you don't know what you're doing with the data, if you don't know who you're disclosing it to, if you don't know how long you're keeping it. And that last point, how long you're keeping it, there does seem to be an increased focus for good reason on record retention. And there are a lot of organizations out there that just because it was the easiest thing to do are keeping data indefinitely. They don't want to run into a scenario where they're looking for some email from a long time ago that happens to be relevant to a new project and they can't find it. They think, there might be some use to the data that they don't know about at the time, but, it might come up later and they want to be able to leverage the data for that purpose. And so in order to be able to have an effective record retention program, and in order to develop these notices and to put yourself in the best position to mitigate your breach risk, you really do have to start by gaining an understanding of what's going on within your data environment. And then you also touched on one other point I want to highlight, which is it's not just your internal systems you have to account for. It's also increasingly the various webs of vendors that you might be working with, providers of various software applications, they may have your data too. And both from the standpoint of responding to, say, that deletion request, but also from the standpoint of managing your data breach risk, you want to identify that piece as well. And that's one that comes up a lot as we work through a data mapping exercise with the client is as we ask various stakeholders about what happens with the data, we learn that there are a bunch of different outside parties that have the data. And maybe the client has a data processing addendum in place with that client, maybe not. Maybe they vetted the security practices of that vendor, maybe not. But that's the type of stuff you want to know about. You don't want to wait till all of a sudden the vendor has a breach and sends you a notice to first learn that you had no DPA with the vendor. You have no means of holding them responsible. You're going to actually end up being the one who looks bad in the scenario because you're going to have to go notify. And then, when the state AG is asking you whether you had a DPA, you're going to have to admit you didn't. So this is all stuff that it's better to flesh out, to get out ahead of. Usually you can still fix it at that point in time. Once you're in the scenario of, a government agency investigating your CCPA compliance or investigating your data breach, that's a bad time to first find out that there were all these areas of risk that you hadn't addressed as an organization because you didn't know they existed.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. It's like maybe not a vendor, but there was a story. Maybe you may remember this also. And if I'm saying this wrong, please correct me. But there was a story, a breach had happened. Company, I think it was like in the upper Midwest, maybe. Anyway, they acquired a company, and they brought them in, and they connected. They got everything set up, set the systems up, and then nobody touched those systems. I think literally for 10 years. And then this company has an incident. Threat actors find that data. They're able to get to that data. They exfiltrate that data. And evidently there was no map. Maybe there was a treasure map. They couldn't find it. I don't know. But they didn't have a sense of what was on, or they didn't look at those systems for a long time. And they wound up having to notify the individuals whose data was on those systems that they acquired 10 years earlier. And the enforcement, the attorney general, I think in 2 states, I want to say it's Pennsylvania and Ohio, but they wound up getting substantially fined. And the basis of that was, look, you had this data for 10 years, not any clear use for it, you just held on to it. And so if someone had done, I think, a pretty basic mapping function, he probably would have found it and said, wow, what are we doing with this? It's like and it's not just systems. It's even, sometimes, companies have these hard copy file storage that no one even knows about. Like they forget. Somebody's just paying like the $200 a month storage bill, and they don't know what's stored there. Just like, yeah, there's a bunch of boxes down there. Nobody really knows what it is. And that may not be as important because, there's probably not criminal threat actors trying to hack into those boxes, right? But the point is, it's knowing that you have it. And I think they can create unintended consequences that really can be pretty impactful. So, but the point I was trying to make is, even in transactions, not just, I think the vendor point, Damon, was absolutely on target and perhaps more important, but even in transactions, when you're exchanging information as part of the purchase or the sale, you want to know what you're giving up, right? If you're turning over equipment to a buyer, what's on that equipment? And, and if you're acquiring stuff, you want to know what's on it because it could create a pretty big risk.
Yeah, we did see, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, there were a number of financial institutions that got hit with big fines because they were disposing of equipment that had personal information stored on it, and they were not wiping it before they were disposing of it. And that type of fact pattern can come up in a lot of different scenarios. It could be the transaction. It could be disposing of the equipment. It could be, the same desktop or laptop that was previously used by someone in HR has now been reprovisioned to someone who's outside of HR and shouldn't have access to, the HR data. And as an organization, you may think, well, all of our data is stored within a couple of applications and these applications are secure. But if you haven't data mapped, you may not be aware that people are also storing stuff locally on their laptops. They could even be storing it on their personal devices. And so you really do want to wrap your head around that because, to the point you raised earlier, Joe, like you could, in a breach scenario, have a situation where someone, say, lost a laptop. And if you are able to say, based on your data map, that there was no PII in that laptop, great. Maybe that saves you a breach. Or if there's a mass exfiltration of data, or if the encryption by the bad actor makes it so that you can't recover your data, if you have a map, you may be able to reverse engineer what was there, which may be helpful operationally. It will also be helpful in determining the scope of the breach. If you don't have that map, you're kind of in the dark and you just have to guess. And usually, if you're guessing, you're probably going to have to be pretty conservative in your assumptions, and that's not going to serve you well. I think, Joe, in wrapping this up, and I think we've talked a lot about why data mapping is a worthwhile exercise, some of the functions it serves. Maybe you could talk a little bit just about the nuts and bolts of what this process looks like. If we're working with a client on a data mapping exercise, what are some of the key steps there?
Well, I was going to ask you that question, but I'll talk about it a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it on you. So I'm going to leave the question. So one question is, who does it? Who does the data map, right? I think once you decide that, which Damon's going to talk about, right? Then you figure out, what's the environment? I think you have to know, what are we looking to find? What do we need to look for? And it's not just what you have. I think you want to, if you're going to do this, you also want to think about data minimization. So I think you want to say, well, what are we collecting? What's the life cycle of a piece of data or an item of data, of a record or whatever? What's the life cycle in our organization? So are we collecting it? Who has access to it? How long are we going to keep it? Where is it stored? Who do we give it to? Who do we disclose it to or share it with? How long do we retain it? What's the process of getting rid of it? And on a prior episode, Damon mentioned something that was important. I thought that can't be repeated enough, and that is documenting this, being able to find it somewhere and substantiate that where this is. In that context, it was documenting privacy policies, and here it's kind of documenting that map so you really can figure it out and be able to use that to your advantage, like in the example Damon gave about investigating a breach and knowing that the laptop doesn't have data. So I think knowing the environment and then really thinking about that life cycle, and then depending on the organization, going about each step in that life cycle to figure out, okay, yeah, this is what we collect. And maybe also, why are we collecting it, right? Because you want to justify from in some cases, if you're talking GDPR, you want to have a legitimate basis for that. And so as part of your map, you want to know, why is this data here? Well, it's here for this reason. Okay, that makes sense, right? And then you move on. But the point is really understanding how and why and where and what we're doing with data at each point in that process. And once you do that, I think it'll be really helpful to kind of build out that map and be in a stronger position. But Damon, can you talk about, I think it does come up as well, who does that process?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to answer it by taking a quick step back, which is that the first step I usually raise when working through this process with clients is creating a list of the data assets, meaning the specific repositories of data that need to be mapped. And some of these are going to be, pretty obvious: email environment, it's a document management system, a CRM, but it could also include, individual workstations or laptops if people are storing information locally. You do want to be mindful of vendors. It could be, web tracking technologies. And the reason I like to start with that inventory of data assets is that that's going to inform who should be involved. Because depending on the data asset, like if it's an HRIS system, like you're definitely going to want some people in HR involved. You probably are going to want someone in IT involved as well. If you're dealing with various different types of web tracking technologies, you're going to want people from marketing involved. If you're dealing with a database that houses financial information, you're going to want someone from the finance team involved. And the reason for that is all of those people are going to have the appropriate institutional knowledge of what's going on within the environment. So there likely is going to be a variety of people who are called on to help with doing the mapping of different assets. Usually the process is overseen by outside counsel working in conjunction with either in-house counsel or compliance or both. And that team of inside and outside counsel and compliance is going to come up with the high-level strategy around what needs to be mapped and how to go about the process and what that should all look like. But there's definitely going to need to be involvement from various others in the organization in order for the mapping to be effective. Because the next step after identifying the assets and figuring out which members of the organization should be involved with respect to the various assets is going through a pretty detailed set of questions, which we work with clients to develop to capture a lot of the information, Joe, that you were talking about earlier. What specific types of information are we collecting? What are we doing with the information? Are we, and this is an issue that's come up a lot recently, are we using AI tools to process that information? Do we have vendors involved in processing the information? How long are we keeping it? And by going through that process, you oftentimes will learn a lot about what your organization is doing with data that you didn't know previously. And that can be helpful in a number of ways. I mean, one, to your point about documentation, at the end of the process, you will have this map that shows that you did diligence on this issue. And you will be able to support what your privacy notices say, support that you have a data minimization program in place. It could help you in the event of breaches. It could help you in the event you get requests from people to exercise their rights. But also it's going to help you create your action plan to better manage risk on a going forward basis. Because maybe you will learn that AI tools are being used to process data that you, meaning the compliance and legal team, didn't know about. And what does that mean in terms of additional compliance requirements under, say, the CCPA or the Colorado AI Act or the EU AI Act? Or you may learn that there are vendors involved in processing data that you didn't know about. So you need to go to those vendors and make sure you have a DPA in place. Or you might learn that you're retaining data for way longer than makes sense. What steps should you take to remedy that? So that, at a very high level, is sort of how I typically will work through the process. Identify the assets, figure out the right internal members of the client's team to help us sort through the questionnaires, complete the questionnaires, review the findings, and then decide what the action items are coming away from those responses.
Well, that's terrific. I think anyone thinking about or asking the question, what is data mining and do we need to do it, is helped by that, Damon. So thanks again. This concludes this podcast. If anybody, again, has any questions or has a topic that you'd like us to address, please email us at privacy@jacksonlewis.com, privacy@jacksonlewis.com. Thanks so much, Damon.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you for listening to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help organizations develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate a workforce that is engaged and stable. Please tune into our next program, where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. We Get Work is available to stream and subscribe on your streaming platform of choice, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.